This conversation with Meir Chaim Posner of Chabad of Yale University digs deep into Kabbalistic terminology and explanations of Kabbalistic concepts like Tzimtzum, which means the contraction of God's infinite energy, or Ein Sof, which means God's infinite energy, Seder Hishtalshlus, which is the cosmic evolution of spiritual realms, or the process of creation, described in Kabbalah. If you're completely unfamiliar with these terms and concepts, please watch this playlist first to get a bit of a picture. Otherwise, let's start.
So we want to explain Seder Hishtalshlus, the cosmic evolution of spiritual realms, which is described in Kabbalah and spoken about, how there's this whole process. So many people are very unfamiliar to this, obviously. So you have the Chabad institution over here, and I'm sure it comes up a lot. You have the opportunity to be teaching this to the unfamiliar ear. But regardless, you have a bit of background with teaching Chassidus, which is Kabbalistic topics. So how would you pick up on this idea? How would you explain to the unfamiliar ear the cosmic evolution of spiritual realms? You mentioned, I think, the Tzimtzum, the contraction in which God removed his infinite energy.
Yeah, so I think your question, it assumes certain predicates that are, I don't mean this in a way of projecting, but I think that the novice or the untrained ear is probably unfamiliar with the axioms to begin with. In other words, when you're referencing Seder Hishtalshlus, and Seder Hishtalshlus is a term, as you mentioned, that is quoted in Chassidus a lot. And it's also a term that really originates in Kabbalah and the mystics. But either there needs to be an acknowledgement that there's a suspension of disbelief, meaning I'm not getting into the conversation or the discussion that makes the argument or compels the listener or the reader to become convinced that this is actually something real, and to what degree it's real, and that this is something relevant, and it's something meaningful, and it's something that resonates and that makes sense. So either we're going to suspend disbelief about that, or we would have that axiomatic conversation first. We would first address the fundamentals, and the fundamentals are, what are we talking about? Don't make any assumptions in a conversation. Always be curious, and always start from the bottom up, from the basics. So a lot, if you're asking a question about what my experience is, so my experience is I think in particular in that realm is not making any assumptions and trying to start from the basics, from the bottom up, from the ground up. Even in my role as a teacher in yeshiva, which I did for a number of years, so I think that was also a tremendous emphasis. A tremendous emphasis was deconstructing previous notions and assumptions. So I don't know if that's where you want to go. I'm happy to address Tzimtzum, but there is certain language that you use that I would initially resist. So the question is, do you want to go there or not?
For example, what would you resist?
So initially, when you opened up the conversation, I think you mentioned that there was evolvement versus devolvement. Right. So I think to the average student of Chassidus, if I were to make a statement such as this, if I were to say, Seder Hishtalshlus doesn't exist, how do you think the average student of Chassidus that has their feet wet to some degree is going to react to that?
You're a heretic?
Okay. So a heretic is a little extreme, because I don't know if Seder Hishtalshlus is one of the 13 principles of faith.
I'm saying if
the
you're
Rambam, right?
If you're a Kabbalistic student.
Right. So you're a heretic of mysticism, of Kabbalah. Right. Okay. Now, the truth is that I don't think that there is a statement that is as accurate as Seder Hishtalshlus doesn't exist. The only thing is that it's not necessarily taught that way. So this is like a perfect example of deconstruction. Deconstruction means I've always imagined, and I use the term imagine deliberately, because I think imagine is the power of imagination is the wrong tool to use to engage with Chassidus and Kabbalah, etc. What we need to use is logic and understanding, intellect, not imagination. So if I were to, I've been taught and trained to imagine Seder Hishtalshlus. And when I imagine things, so as things are imagined, they don't necessarily have to make sense, they just have to fit. Is that a distinction that resonates?
I think I was actually just having a bit of a similar, perhaps, discussion to exactly this idea. Like, for example, I was discussing this. Can you fit an elephant into a keyhole, right? So that is something which cannot be imagined, right? In other words, it can't be. But then, can you imagine yourself jumping from the sidewalk onto the top of a building? You can imagine that, right? It's just not realistic. So, in other words, it doesn't necessarily. So I guess it's the second point that we're referring to. It. You can imagine something which is not necessarily very realistic. That's
exactly. It doesn't. Imagination is not necessarily compelling intellectually.
right.
It might be compelling in a fantastical sense. For whatever reason, it's cool to think about it this way, or it's cool to imagine this.
Right.
And Chassidus is anything but that. So the question should not be, how do we imagine Seder Hishtalshlus? The question should be, how do we understand Seder Hishtalshlus?
Right.
Okay. So there are two sub-branches of that I'd want to briefly address. One is, how do we understand Seder Hishtalshlus? By defining it. Definitions are the key. Language is the key to understanding. Understanding is the key to not imagining. Does that fit? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that sounds right.
So defining it would mean finding good colloquial terms that actually define it. So that's kind of one branch. How do we define Seder Hishtalshlus? The other one is more on the negative end of things, which is the moment we understand it as opposed to imagine it, so we no longer use terms that imply or that are bound by like temporal scenarios or spatial scenarios. So we no longer talk about Seder Hishtalshlus using a term or a word like happen. The term happen can only apply to something that happens, right? Well, guess what? Seder Hishtalshlus doesn't happen. Only things that are imagined within the realm of Zman and Makom. These are of course, the Hebrew terms for time and space. And if they exist within time and space, so then we can use terms like when did it happen, how did it happen. Those are terms that should not be applied to Seder Hishtalshlus ever. And I understand that that younger students of either mysticism or Hasidus might find that difficult, or maybe don't have the proper training to appreciate nuance and abstract ideas that are detached from a limited temporal or spatial context. But as we mature and matriculate, we have to get past that. And we have to learn how to understand it as opposed to imagine it. So evolve, devolve. There was language. I believe, I don't want to go back and look at the tape, but I think that there was language that either implied or even directly used terms like happen. Okay. So that's something that I'd be careful about. This is not telling you what to be careful about as much as I'm saying that if I was sitting with a student, I would definitely seize the opportunity to straighten that out.
So you're pointing out very important things, obviously, for any student of Kabbalah, right? Because especially if you peek into older Kabbalistic works, the original Kabbalistic works, you'll find a lot of visualizations, a lot of drawings, diagrams. Also the Sephirot, which we might talk about or people might be familiar with. There's a diagram depicting the spheres in order. It's very visual. You can somewhat see it, but it's not that. It's not. There's no diagrams. It's diagrams to explain an idea. I am in our project in Kabbalah Demystified. We are doing a lot of animations and trying to make things visual. Me personally, I'm a very when I learn Kabbalistic ideas, I do visualize them. Like the way I understand things are visual, but I do feel like I go beyond that and understand that it's not. I think I would agree with you that these are conceptual ideas and they're spiritual, they're beyond time and space, and they do need to be, so to speak, unclothed from their physicality. We need to remove our human understanding of these ideas. I would definitely stress that idea too. Yes.
Okay, so given that that's the case,
Yes.
I think that brings us back to, if you want to talk about Tzimtzum, and I'm happy to talk about anything you know, wherever you want to take this. But I made a statement. I said Seder Hishtalshlus doesn't exist.
Right.
So I think at this point, we have at least some degree of clarity as to what my intent was there. A, it doesn't exist in the conventional sense of existence. It might, that's like on a basic level, you know, to the same degree that, you know, the chair occupies space and exists within space, within a spatial context, and it also occupies time. It's whatever. It's a certain number of years old, and will be here for a certain number of years. In this current and particular form, eventually it'll disintegrate and turn into something else. Seder Hishtalshlus doesn't exist in that sense. That's a given. I think we agree on that.
Yeah.
But then I would go even further and beyond, and this will segue directly into the Tzimtzum conversation. Again, it's up to you. You can take it where you want it to go, but this can segue into the Tzimtzum conversation. There was a phrase. I just want to use language that the audience will understand and appreciate. So you'll tell me if something needs to be defined a little further. But there's a very fundamental work by the Rebbe Rashab called Sefer HaMaimarim Tafresh Samach Vav. Is your audience familiar with that?
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay. So you can look it up. Tafresh Samach Vav is a reference to the year that it began to be delivered. So this is, of course, I learned it out of the old print, but I think in the new print, it's probably about 1,200 pages or so. And it was delivered over the course of 2 years or so. It was delivered orally, but it was actually written before it was delivered orally, and then the written form was published years later. So Tafresh Samach Vav is just a reference to the Hebrew year
5666, I believe.
right, which is 1906, I believe, right? 1905, 1906.
There's a 40-year gap, no?
Yeah, no, I'm pretty confident. If I'm wrong, you'll correct me later.
Whatever. Yeah.
So 1906, and this was delivered over between 1906 and 1908. And although, interestingly, this Samach Vav is considered perhaps one of the most thorough, structured, and organized works of Hasidus, in the sense that it kind of leaves nothing untouched in a very systemic way. If you study through it, you'll find that there's basically nothing in Kabbalah that is neglected there. So obviously, it's going to address Tzimtzum. But the fascinating part of Samach Vav is that it doesn't address Tzimtzum in a direct manner. It almost uses a whole different set of language about Tzimtzum. Instead of using the term Tzimtzum, it uses the term Oyer. Oyer is a term that I'm going to hesitate or resist translating at the moment, because it's a whole nother, a whole separate bucket. But the way it presents Oyer and the way it discusses Oyer, it's entangled with the Tzimtzum conversation. And one of the lines that he uses there is that all Oyer, shelifnei hatzimtzum, all Oyer that is beyond Tzimtzum, is Ur hakolul be'atzmusai. Just be patient for a moment as I'll translate. Okay.
I think maybe just before we jump
Sure.
into this, could we perhaps can you explain for about 2 minutes in short what's the tzimtzum? Why is it necessary? I'm not sure if we covered that, and we're
No,
mentioning
we
so many
actually
times.
didn't. But that's kind of like the point that we're going from. I'm saying Seder Hishtalshlus doesn't exist. Why do I say it doesn't exist? Because in the presence of the Creator, there is no room for anything other than the Creator. Everything is Him. Him not in a gendered way, obviously. Him as an it, however you want to phrase it. There's no space, literal space, proverbial space, figurative space. There is no nothing other than the Creator. So where is there a Seder Hishtalshlus? Literally and figuratively. There's no room for it. Anything that there is just the Creator. It's just Him.
So right now we're talking in a space, so to speak, non-space, where there is only God. Is that what we're trying to say?
Well, if you say there's a space, then you're saying there's a
space.
Right. There is only God.
There is only God.
Period.
Very good.
Right.
But there is. You just made a problem.
Even that
Right.
is perhaps a leap, a supposition of sorts. Tzimtzum is if there is only Him, so how is it that at least I perceive myself and I perceive my surroundings as if there is something other than Him?
Right. So we made a statement that there is God, and now so how do we exist? That's the question.
Yeah, but I think that's again, I'm going to go back to my original statement because I think that's an oversimplification because it assumes that you do exist, and it assumes that I exist, and it assumes that creation exists. And I'm saying no, it doesn't. It just perceives itself as if it exists, and there's a distinction there, right? But even that perception, there needs to be some space given for that perception, even though that perception is not necessarily the real truth. But ultimately, if that perception is allowed to exist, there needs to be some space given for that. And when Kabbalah talks about Tzimtzum, Kabbalah is saying that the fact that you perceive yourself as if you exist is because there's a part of God that doesn't look like God.
Look.
Well, I'm using those terms figuratively, obviously. In other words, there's a part of God that doesn't even realize that it's part of God.
It doesn't look like God.
Doesn't look like God, not to itself, and even not to God. But doesn't mean it's not Him. It just means that it's a part of Him that doesn't look like Him and doesn't experience itself as part of Him. So that's Tzimtzum, and that's a deliberate form of Tzimtzum known as Tzimtzum Shaloi Kipshutai. Is that clear?
What's the difference? So maybe we should clarify, what does God look like? And what does it mean that there's a part of Him that doesn't look like God?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question because obviously Tzimtzum is only necessary if God looks like something. And therefore, when you're talking about God that is beyond even the definition, that doesn't meet any conditions whatsoever, not even the conditions of it existing. In other words, a God beyond even a God which is beyond even the standard of existence. So obviously that doesn't need Tzimtzum because the existence of creation, the perception that creation has of itself, that it exists, doesn't interfere with a God that doesn't have any conditions, or that doesn't have any definitions or limitations. But when we define God as infinite, so infinite by definition implies that it occupies all, and it is all. And if there would be anything other than all, that means that it necessarily interferes with and gets in the way with that all. If it gets in the way of that, then there needs to be some space for it to be able to see itself as if it's interfering.
So we're going with the understanding of God is infinite?
For the sake of Tzimtzum, yes.
So in other words, when we say God looks like something, in other words, in what way does God express himself in an infinite form, truly infinite? In other words, everything and anything.
Correct.
Good.
Right. And this is what Chassidus refers to as Eir Ein Sof. The Eir Ein Sof is all-encompassing, is everything, and as a result of that, Eir Ein Sof is quote-unquote disturbed and interfered with if there is something other than it.
So that's where we're coming to the conversation of Tzimtzum.
Yes.
So what's
but I think that really kind of skirts like the main conversation. The main conversation is it's like I was saying earlier, Seder Hishtalshlus doesn't exist. Eir Ein Sof doesn't exist. Tzimtzum doesn't either exist to a certain degree. What do we mean by that? If it all is just a perception, and it's just within the presence of Hashem, everything is Him. It's not really about making space for something else as much as it's allowing for something else to actually have a relationship. Should I elaborate?
Yes, please.
There are certain, I think, preconditions to a relationship. Obviously, there are various different types of relationships, but I think it's a leap to call a forced or imposed connection or a forced or imposed relationship as a genuine and authentic relationship. Why?
Why is a forced relationship ingenuine?
Yes, inauthentic.
Because a relationship means that the person connects with the other from within himself.
Right. So in other words, it's not really giving the other significance. It's not really valuing the other. In fact, a forced relationship is perhaps just a means of negating or eliminating the other, which is the opposite of what a relationship is really about. So if we accept that premise that a relationship is one that includes two parties and their active and wholehearted participation, then each party in the relationship needs to have space to be able to feel like they are a part of it. If the connection between creator and creation is one that can only be understood and appreciated and experienced by means of saying, well, the creator can do anything. The creator can even have a relationship with you. He can do anything because he's infinite. That's a forced relationship. That means that your terms are not being taken into consideration in that relationship. The relationship is only a relationship because God scripted it and forced it on you. There's no room for you to experience it on your terms. Seder Hishtalshlus and Tzimtzum in particular is the opportunity for you to experience it on your terms, to experience it at your pace, under your initiation, where you are the starting point, as opposed to the creator being the starting point. Because the creator being the starting point, he can do anything. That doesn't mean that he's having a relationship with you. That means that he's forcing a relationship on you, at best. Am I making sense?
This is a very interesting articulation. And I agree with it. I've just never heard it in this way. It's very, very cool, actually. What you're saying is that I've seen it in very different terms, as in like that God wants to dwell within this world, within human beings who refine this world and make it a better place, a dwelling place for His infinity, His essence, right? So there's the question of why did He need to do that if He's perfect? He even, or if He's everything, so He already had this within Him beforehand. And I do see how this conversation is going to lead into the Tzimtzum, which means the removal of God, which means, so to speak, the removal of God, which means the allowance for there to be something separate, other than God, and then afterwards this infinite light of God is brought back into this empty space. And I guess that's where that question is answered. And why did he need to create it by removing himself first? He should have just created it by leaving himself in it. Why does he need us to bring him back into it? You're saying a very interesting point, and that is that then that would be a forced relationship. That wouldn't be God down in the other place. That would be...
But that wouldn't be you owning God or you introducing God into that space. That would be God entering at his own discretion. Yeah, which doesn't allow for your privacy, your discretion and your agency. So that's and I believe that's what Seder Hishtalshlus is. That's what Tzimtzum is. Obviously, Seder Hishtalshlus consists of many, many layers. But Seder Hishtalshlus are layers of an extrapolation, which means you can have two things that are experienced entirely differently by two different parties.
Should we just preface what is Hishtalshlus?
Yeah, I want to preface. I'll address that.
Okay.
Yeah, you can have two people that experience something entirely differently, even though and even if they are experiencing the net result in the same way. So we can talk about intellect, or we can talk about wealth. Like you can have a billionaire who's a nepo billionaire, right? Who had inherited billions of dollars from their parents. So they were essentially born a billionaire. And then you can have a billionaire that has actually started from nothing and had scraped together every penny, every dollar, every thousand, every million, both in terms of hard work and grit, and in terms of mindful of their accumulation of wealth, et cetera, et cetera. Now they're both worth 10 billion, whatever it is. But one of them has actually experienced what it means to count every dollar until they got to 10,000, 100,000, etc., and then count every 1,000 or every 100,000 until a million, and to count every million until a billion, etc. Well, the other one never counted any of it. So, we're not talking about the technical accumulation of dollar for dollar, but it's kind of like the mentality of how a wealthy person thinks and lives. And it is possible for each one of these types of let's say wealthy people to adopt the mindset of the other. So it's more of like a figurative analogy. Similarly, you can say in intellect, you can have people that are brilliant and immediately understand a very deep concept or idea to its greatest depth, without having to go through a journey of first understanding it at kind of like a shallow level, and then digging deeper until eventually they come to a deep intellectual appreciation. And this is true really across the board. I mean, if you've met like talented musicians, you'll find that there are those that had to do a lot of training until they got to a point where they can train their ear and their hands to be able to play, music on various different instruments in a way that flows, and a way that is, highly in tune, etc. And then there are those that are like born with perfect pitch, and there isn't like a journey and practice and training in the same way that the other person went through. They're both experiencing the same thing: an incredibly deep appreciation and perception of music, or an incredibly deep appreciation and perception of intellectual ideas, or an incredibly deep perception of wealth. But one of them went through many, many steps to get there, while the other one didn't. Experienced many steps to get there. So this is what I'm referencing, is that Seder Hishtalshlus didn't happen. It's just like, to what degree is the creator real and present? Well, that depends on the person. Some people experience reality as one which is completely and entirely detached from the creator. And not only are they agnostic towards the creator, they are like actively skeptical about the notion of a creator, because the notion of a creator is just not obvious. And I would say it's beyond not obvious. Like there's good grounds for their skepticism. And they can perhaps come to a place where they get past that and they begin to kind of recognize the creator's involvement to some degree in creation. But they're still perceiving the creator's involvement as an involvement that kind of is very detached from the realities of what we experience. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a righteous person that Kabbalah calls a tzaddik. The tzaddik, to begin with, experiences reality very different than the average person. Obviously, there's a very broad spectrum in between. But the tzaddik's reality is that the tzaddik looks around and doesn't see things in the way that I do, because I'm the furthest thing from the tzaddik. The tzaddik sees, wow, that's an incredible expression of God's creative powers. Because the tzaddik sees creation in the same way that an artist looks at a Van Gogh, or a musician hears, a Bach or something like that, where you hear the composer and the artist within the art, within the music, etc.
Right. So we spoke about the process, the person who worked on his knowledge, worked on his riches. So I think what you were getting at was that the person who worked on it, it's part of him now. It's within him. It's part of his experience. It's not just technical that he has it. It's part of him. This is who he is. It becomes what he is. Like a person who's smart and just understands everything simply, they can, I guess, perhaps get any career, and they can be a security guard and just show everybody how smart they are. They won't necessarily appreciate it, but a person who worked on his knowledge wants to be involved in it all the time. It's part of him. This is who he's become. So I guess you would compare that.
Right. So I was saying this more in the context of Seder Hishtalshlus.
Right.
You asked to define Seder Hishtalshlus. Seder Hishtalshlus is the process. It could be the process in which a creation has the ability to trace creation back to the creator. That's it. That's like the takeaway. The takeaway is that there is a link. It all starts with relationship, right? There's a link between creation and creator. But that link is not a forced or imposed link. That link is one where, on your terms, you can peel back and see how actually I didn't just spontaneously emerge. There's a part of God which actually allows for me. Like I'm within him. How am I going to discover that I'm within him? Well, I start with where I am, and I peel back layers. I say, a milder version would allow for more God and less ego. A milder version than that would allow for, again, even more God and less ego. Till I get to a point where I see myself as just part of God. Now, adopting that as your actual reality, takes either a lot of work or a lot of psychedelics, but or not that much, but at least like conceptually we can appreciate that.
So Hishtalshlus is really just, would you say, the process which brings from an infinite God to us physicals?
No. And I'm saying a hard no, not to be confrontational, not to be difficult. I could be difficult, but that's not the intent here.
Right.
The intent is that everything we've discussed until now was kind of to pave the way to say, no, it didn't happen. God didn't create using Hishtalshlus.
Instead it is, how can I, well, let's go back to the analogy. How can the Nepo wealthy person, or how can the perfect pitch person appreciate what it's like
for a musician that needed lots of training, how can they experience it? Seder Hishtalshlus is the ability for the creation to appreciate their relationship with the Creator by peeling back layers and extrapolating that if I am here, then I can kind of see a link of where I may have came from within God Himself. How God did it, I don't know. That's none of our business. I don't even care.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know if I'm coming across.
I think I understood it the other way around.
Right. I mean, in the typical terms of Chassidus, it would be, it's not Momaila Lamata, it's Momata Lamaila, and it's only Momata Lamaila. So those are terms that would need greater definition, perhaps, for the audience. But you can take a stab at it if you'd like. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm understanding now is, originally the way I was understanding was you were saying that there's that I thought you were explaining why God, so to speak, needed to remove Himself and give us the process of becoming, so to speak, a professional musician, a person who brings God into him. Why couldn't God just throw the talent of music onto us? In other words, throw godliness onto us. That's what I thought you were getting to, but I think you're getting to a bit of a different point, and that is that we are the professional musician. In other words, God gave us existence, and Hishtalshlus is the process. Hishtalshlus is peeling off the layers of how we came into existence.
So let's go back for a second, because the distinction that you made is an accurate one, but there's one gap here. Is that no, we exist, and being the musician means that it depends. There's a tzaddik that exists as a perfect musician, and then there's everyone else basically that exists as someone who, if they put enough practice, they'll become a very good musician.
Right.
Seder Hishtalshlus is the ability to be able to recognize and experience God's presence in creation by seeing how creation actually can originate from God itself. But not that in the same way that if I go to that billionaire and I say, I mean, this is really the point that I was trying to make. I think we got a little distracted. So let me kind of regroup and go back to that. If I go to the billionaire and I say, do you have $100? What's the answer?
Yes.
Yes, but also that's like a complete, injustice to what their actual wealth is. So yes doesn't feel right either, right? In other words, the way that they have it is not that they actually possess $100. It's that I don't lack $100. That's really what we're saying. Or the Einstein versus the average person, and the average person, like, do you understand this on this and this level, which is a shallow level? The answer is yes. Einstein, do you understand it on this and this level, which is a shallow level? The answer is no. Einstein does not understand it on that shallow level. But neither is Einstein missing something.
Right.
They're not lacking the fact that they don't understand it the way a first grader would understand it. Because what they have includes within it, in a sense, includes within it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be present in it, that it has to occupy space there. It doesn't have to exist. So what I mean is that these kind of realms that we talk about, as far as God is concerned, do they actually exist? Well, the best I can say about it is that they don't not exist. That's kind of like a double negative, but think about it, right?
Right.
They don't not exist. But do they exist? Well, that's not a fair thing to say either.
Right.
But to me, they do exist. Because to me, the only way I can see my connection to the Creator is if I recognize that this is not how I got here, but if I want to build back to like where within God itself there's room for me, that's the way I would build it back. So going back to the analogy is, the billionaire, they may not even have $1 in their pocket to give you, to give the panhandler, because they don't have $1, but they don't lack $1, right? But for me, I need that $1, and I need another $1, and I need another $1 to get to $1 billion. So Seder Hishtalshlus is that it's okay for me, for the creation. It's okay for the creation to appreciate God by gathering $1 and another $1, by practicing again and again until I got really good at it. That's what a Seder Hishtalshlus means. Does it make sense?
To accumulate, so to speak,
Right.
more godliness.
To accumulate experience of God's presence in creation. To accumulate perception of God's presence in creation. But this is like a deliberate deviation from talking about Seder Hishtalshlus as if it's something that exists somewhere. I don't know if that's coming across, but at least that's what I'm attempting to do.
So you're saying Hishtalshlus doesn't exist. Maybe I'll say how I would see it.
Sure.
And then you'll say if this is not what you're saying. So the way I see it is that we're finite physical beings, right? So for finite physical beings to exist from God, there needs to be God creates us, right? And for those who are seasoned Kabbalah students, they would know that not only does God create us one time in the past, many years ago, but there is a constant creation. In other words, the physical cannot exist on its own, and God is constantly, in other words, our terms of time and space use the word constant. It's obviously going to have to be understood somehow differently from a more godly perspective, but God is constantly putting energy and power into the world. In other words, this world cannot exist on its own. That energy and power is Hishtalshlus. Now, that Hishtalshlus has within it many stages. It's first very godly, and then it gets closer and closer to creation through a sequence of events, some of which are considered relatable one to the next, an evolution or a devolution, as you tried to negate in the beginning. In other words, the light the power of God diminishes. What does that mean that it diminishes? So if you want to write the letter A on a piece of paper, and you're going to take all the power of your hand to write that letter A, you're not going to get the letter A, because you need to have a minimized amount of power put into your hand to get that perfect letter A. So there needs to be a concealment, a contraction. The power needs to be a bit minimized, and in some cases there needs to be a leap. Like the creation of the physical, there needs to be a leap over there, where suddenly something comes out of nothing, not even of a contraction. It's just something completely new, like pow. So I would agree that there's not like a whole sequence, and this is not taking place somewhere. This is all really within us. This is what we are. This is how God creates us. This is what creation is. God could have obviously done it in a different way, perhaps, but this is how we understand it in our minds. This is what makes sense and what Kabbalah teaches.
So again, I don't mean to be difficult. I mean, it's fine if that's the way you understand it, but that's definitely not. I would contrast that, and sometimes with subtleties, you adjust language in a very subtle way, and it means something else, because I believe that the way you presented it presents a trap. The trap is I can't talk about it without using temporal language. Like you use the term series of events. To me, that's using analogies that most people have aged out of. But when I was a kid, we had something called a chalkboard. Do you remember those? And if you scratch a chalkboard. So to me, hearing a series of events in the context of Seder Hishtalshlus is cringe. Now, that's not you're not cringe, don't worry. But when I hear that, like, you're missing the point. Or when you're saying that creation is constantly recreated, here's like, it's a trap where you're almost forced to use language that materializes Seder Hishtalshlus. And I'm trying to be as careful and as deliberate as I can to go away, to depart from that. So here's an example, like a subtle, perhaps, but very distinct adjustment of language, and your whole presentation could sound different. Instead of saying that God constantly recreates, say creation is constantly dependent on. Do you hear the difference?
I hear the difference, yeah.
One is a reference to creation's experience. The other is a reference to what God does. We don't know what God does. I would take it a step further. I would say God doesn't create. Because when we talk about create, when we use the term create, what are we referencing? Artists create. Musicians create. Creativity is a reference to producing. Producing is like an expansion of self and an expansion of production from self in the human context, right? The more I create, the more I produce, the more stuff there is that came from me, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Definitely,
right?
Yes.
Creation in the godly sense is exactly the opposite. It's a reduction of self. Creation is less God. So even saying God did something is not describing creation. God doesn't do anything. God just made less of himself, which allowed for what we experience as something new. But it's really nothing new. It was always there. He just allowed it to not look like him anymore. Does that last sentence make sense? I can repeat it. I just want to know if it's landing.
Let's
okay?
repeat it. Let's repeat it.
Everything was always here. Was always here.
Because God has within him everything.
Exactly. It's just that 6,000 years ago or so, it emerged as that which was always God is not God anymore. Or it doesn't look like or feel like God anymore. So is it really something new? Or is it just a reduction of God? Proverbial reduction of God. Containment of God. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I think I understand what you're saying.
So in other words, contrasting, normally we think of creation as making more. Actually, it's making less when we're talking about God.
Yeah.
So these are just two simple examples of subtle differences in how we talk and think about things. Instead of saying God constantly recreates, which like creates this mental pretzel of what do you mean? But there is no time. Not only is no time, God creates time. So when you're saying God constantly recreates time, that sentence doesn't make sense because constant applies to time, right? So what do you mean God constantly recreates? And you yourself were addressing that when you presented this verse. You were addressing that by saying whatever that means, whatever, right? Because we don't have, like, just let go of that. God doesn't constantly recreate. We are constantly dependent on him. Whole different ballgame. You just simplified the whole thing. Stop talking about God and talk about us. Not talk about us like in a selfish way.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about what we're experiencing, which immediately flows to the rest of what you were saying. It flows to Seder Hishtalshlus also. There's no events that are happening. Rather, what am I experiencing and what perception do I have? And that perception can be because there is a perception that is more mild than that. And there's a perception that is, so I can actually trace it. So that, and I'm not trying to belabor the point. I just want to and if it's not something that resonates and doesn't land well, that's okay. Let's move on to something else. But, I'm not having a debate about it. I understand, like not
Right.
everyone appreciates this
I
kind of.
think I'm actually appreciating it.
Just want to be
And I
clear.
think
I'm
this
not
is a
forcing
very-
it down anyone's throat.
I like this discussion.
But it does take time to adjust to that, to that differently, to adjust to like 1 second. I need to like, let me be clear. I was in the same space as you.
Right.
I was a student in yeshiva, and I also used to use terms like God constantly recreates.
Right.
But at some point, if you train yourself to think in the abstract, to understand in the abstract, but using definitive language, then you just don't say God recreates anymore. You just say we are dependent on God constantly, which actually makes sense, as opposed to saying God recreates.
Right. I think that the term God recreates, in other words, we exist in in a world which operates with time. So for us to conceptualize that we are right now dependent on God, and that this moment is in space and time is an iteration of God's energy, the way we would say that is that right now we cannot exist on our own. There needs to be, it's as if we were created right now. So if I were to, let's say, put this on a map, in other words, instead of saying that time is past, present, and future, and instead of saying that we can look 1,000 years back and God created us every single moment again and again and again and again, we can, so to speak, look at it from God's perspective, and that is that time is all on a map right in front of him. There's no past, no present, and future. He can see it all right here. It's all there, right?
Or not. Or none of it exists.
In other words,
again, does the billionaire have $1?
But I think
does the genius have
right,
like
in that way,
a first grader's understanding?
In that way.
What do you mean
in
in that way?
In other
Who are
words,
we fooling?
is there a specific,
as far as God is
energy?
concerned, this is all nothing.
Right. So what I'm referring to, is there a specific, so to speak, piece of energy that is giving us life right now, which is different from the one a moment ago? Is there a different piece of energy, so to speak, giving this chair life than that of which is giving my body life?
So all of that, I could engage with that. I prefer not to. In other words, I could engage with like 1 second. So what are you imagining? Some kind of pieces of energy floating out of some kind of a big monster being of some sort. That's not what we're dealing with. None of that exists. It's not real.
I agree with you that spirituality is not bound to time and space, but I think where I prefer, I do like using temporal terms and spatial terms, and then showing the paradox within it. In other words, saying that God creates us every moment, but that he is beyond time and space, or saying that God is really everything, or in other words, God does not lack anything, the double negative over there, and then introducing that we are a creation, something new, which did not exist within God, so to speak. And then when you put these two paradoxes, or that paradox, and you look at them together and you're like, ooh, that's a problem, you realize that you must remove the human conceptual idea from that. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, sometimes when you see a contradiction in a paper, where somebody has an opinion and you find a contradiction in their opinion, so you can call them out for being wrong if one day they said something and then 10 years later they said the opposite, and you're like, whoa, you just contradicted yourself. 10 years ago you said that. And you might be right because maybe they forgot what they said and they changed their mind, and they have in fact contradicted themselves, and then they'll have to say they changed their mind. But if you find in one paper, one sentence in the same article, in the beginning it says one thing, and then 2 lines later it says another thing, and this person is known to be a smart person, he knows what he's saying, so he obviously wasn't contradicting himself. And where did I find this? There's a big debate among the Chabad scholars. Does God need us or not? right?
Oh boy, it's a rabbit hole.
So I don't want to
Can
go
I drink some coffee? Yeah.
have some coffee.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
I don't want to go into the rabbit hole, but it's funny because so in the same talk of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, known as the Rebbe, I can put the source in the description. Look what the Sichas Chelik Vav Shmois, second Sikha. That was a bunch of code. So there is one footnote which states God's desire for creation is in his essence. And then another footnote, one page before or 2 pages before, which says God does not need anything. Right? So one person told me when I told him God's desire to create us is in his essence. In other words, the reason that God created us is in his essence. He said, you can't really say that there's a reason for our creation within God's essence. It's not really correct. And another person said, God needs us. And then the other party has a problem with that statement because how can you say God needs us? Right here it says God doesn't need anything. But when I look at those two statements and I'm like, this is talking about the same thing. God's essence doesn't need anything because he's perfect. Within God's essence, he created us. So what does that mean? That his essence, which doesn't need anything, so to speak, created us for the deepest reason from his own essence. He created us without the need, which makes it so much more deeper. And how would I explain that? Our human needs are dependent on things that we lack, and therefore we need to have a coffee when you're about to enter a distressful conversation, right? So that's because of something else. Everything is dependent.
So okay, so where are you going with this?
So what I want to say is that I agree with this approach of removing all temporal definitions and conversations from these spiritual and infinite and really undefined ideas because they're beyond our human definition and comprehension. I do agree with that, but sometimes the way I like doing it and the way I personally comprehend it is I'll comprehend something in a temporal way and then realize that it's not in a temporal way. And then when you contrast these two ideas together, you devisualize it, if that's a word, and you understand that the paradox is a very real thing. Mm-hmm. And
again, are you saying that that's the way you handle or manage these things, or are you saying that no, you see value in approaching it in this way?
This is personally how I would understand it. Like, for example, before you were explaining how we're really just like from God. You want to say that in your words, in case I was misphrasing it?
We're dependent on the Creator.
In other words, we're not something new. We were always part of the everything of God. Right. So,
and creation is just the reduction.
So the way I would like to describe that is that we are something new. But
so I'm asking why?
Because I think that to a sense that helps us understand what it.
What does it?
Be
very specific. What does it help? In what way does it help? Not just help. In what way does it advance a person's understanding in a way that is better than and superior to saying, 1 second, let's just let go of all that?
Because I do think that the statement that we were, so to speak, already in God cannot be taken on its own. Because when you tell somebody we were just...
I mean creation, but creation was always, go ahead.
I don't think we're disagreeing over here in conceptually. I think it's more just how it should be explained. When we say creation, we mean something new which wasn't there before. In other words, God created us and we weren't there before. Mm-hmm. So that tells you that God is perfect. We are not perfection. And
I'm not getting an answer to my question.
What's the question?
The question is, in what way is using this, paradoxical contrast. The first, using
understanding it temporally.
Exactly, and using materialistic and literal terms, and then contrasting that. How does that provide a better, more quality
understanding,
superior understanding? Like, what value does that bring to a person's understanding?
Because I would argue,
what value does it bring that you can't get with that only this can bring to the person?
I feel that you can only appreciate the deconstruction of the humanization of these ideas once you've tried understanding them in human forms and you realize that it's not in the human form, and you kind of, and I'll tell you specifically to what
I'm going to be honest. I'm not persuaded at all.
let me try to see if from what you were saying that we're a continuation from God. Yeah. I think that is somewhat of a temporal way of understanding how we originate in God. Perhaps a more correct way, a more intellectual way to understand how we originate in God and understand in what way we originate in God is understanding that we are something new, which was not within God. But
okay, so I'm gonna make your case.
I think, in other words,
better than you're making it.
Okay,
but I'm gonna make that case in a way that's also like appreciating what the point is. In other words, like this. I think that some people struggle with kind of connecting the dots, or like seeing a bridge between point A and point B, where it's like this. If there's no time and God is not recreating creation every single second, it's just that I am dependent on God every single second, right? We kind of went through that already, right? I'm dependent because I do experience time. Creation does experience time. So the term being dependent on him every second does make sense, but the term he creating us every second doesn't make sense. We went through that, right? Because he doesn't have time. He actually created time. So far we're in agreement?
But I think that there is a bit of a place where it does make sense to say that God is creating us every moment.
Explain.
And that is, tell me how. If you look at it from God's perspective, so to speak, so this is what we're trying to do in this conversation. We're trying to not look at it temporally. In other words, we're trying to see it from the way God would see it. So then I would agree that there is no moment.
Okay, so we're on the same page. What you're saying is that it's really us. So I'm just saying, let's just be more clear about that by using the term dependent as opposed to created. That's all I'm saying. Because the term dependent just says what you're saying, and without getting complicated, without allowing for confusion. Because you're also acknowledging that when you're saying God creates us every single second, you're not talking about from God's perspective, right?
Right. From a non-temporal perspective, right?
So in other words, we're really agreeing,
right?
And I'm suggesting that instead of going to a place where we have like confusion about what that language might mean, let's just go to a place where it's very clear. It's very clear that when we say dependent, we know we're just talking about from our perspective. So but again, I want to go back and say, I'll make your case in a stronger way, which is that it could feel like if God is not creating creation every single second, that means that creation doesn't really have, every second of creation is not entirely purposeful.
If God is not creating creation every single second, then it could sound like every moment in creation is not purposeful. Okay, you're saying my
exactly.
Argument. Okay,
exactly. And I think that's where there's a little bit of like an adjustment, like people have an issue, like there's a shock.
Yeah, you took the words. That's exactly what I was about to say, and then you took the words out of my mouth.
Okay.
Let me just add to that.
Yeah. And I obviously have a response to that, not just a response, like an answer to the question. I have okay, so that might be the only value that it provides, is that it gives you a sense of purpose in everything, right?
But I think also dependence can be like a child depends on their parent, perhaps, right? Or all humans depend really on each other, and we have needs. But while creation means that our essence.
Yeah, so I would add that word. Sure, fair criticism there, which is like, instead of saying we are absolutely dependent on the Creator, say our essential existence is absolutely dependent on the Creator. That could be modified, yeah.
But then the question is there a logical, persuasive argument? In other words, and why? In other words, why would I like to logically, persuasively, philosophically understand this? Is because I think that the logical argument is what makes it understood. Not that I'm
Logical argument to what?
that we are constantly being created by God.
So again,
You know,
let's go back. No, of course I don't like it, but I wasn't hiding
Right,
that. Why the only and this goes back to the purposeful part of it, and I think there are a few distinctions that we need to make, but each one is kind of its own bucket, and it takes time to unpack, and you can't just you can't drink the ocean in one sitting, right? So I don't know. I'm not sure where to go, but I'll try to make a couple of quick distinctions. Number one is there's a difference between using Hebrew words because they're important. There's a difference between a nivra and a nivchar. A nivra can be loosely translated as a creation. A nivchar can be loosely translated as a chosen. Out of the gate, the distinction between them is that a nivra is conditional, a nivchar is not conditional. That's one very, very clear distinction. So,
what do you mean by conditional?
Conditional means that there isn't a commitment to the creation itself. It's there for the sake of something else, or it's there as long as it's providing this value. Once it's not providing this value, that there's no reason for it to exist.
Creation needs to provide value while a chosen doesn't.
Exactly. A chosen is unconditional. A chosen can. So here's an example. If creation defies its creator in a way that the creator did not design it to be, it ceases to exist. If something chosen defies that which chose it is still bound by its commitment to that which was chosen to that which it chose. So that's one important bucket. Then there's another one which goes into the conversation about purpose in every moment, purpose in every detail, purpose in everything. Seeing or detecting purpose is connected to and dependent on, which is what you said earlier, is dependent on there being something innovative here, something novel, something that did not exist previously. I sense that that's what you were bothered by. How can we say that creation is not something new? Because if it's not something new, so then nothing really happened here. And if nothing really happened there, so what's the purpose of this whole thing? It's not even a real thing. Am I?
But not only that, I think, in other words, on the flip side of the coin, is that if we say that we're something new, it will also show how face value we are also absolutely insignificant. In other words, we're not part of God before, because God is everything. God is everything.
So this is exactly what the point is that there's an aspect which is new, but the aspect which is new is really an across-the-board, universal, equal aspect in everything in creation, and that is its perception of independent existence. There's a word that Hasidus uses for that. It's called yeshus. Everything is a yesh. In other words, everything perceives itself as if it, and presents and projects itself as if it exists independently. But the chairs, the walls, the people, and even things that are metaphysical, like time, like music, like feelings, like thoughts. Those are also things that did not that have this new kind of twist to it. And what's that new twist? That new twist is that it perceives, it has yeshus. It perceives itself as if it exists independently. Did the actual object appear and emerge, or did it emerge as its own being through creation? And that's the distinction that I'm drawing. What I'm saying is that it always existed. It just never existed with yeshus. So there is something new. And what is new is that every creation has yeshus. And therefore, everything has its purpose. Ultimately, I think that there's more of like an emotional resistance that people would have because it's different than what we're used to. It's very different than what we're used to. It's very different than, so yeah. Anyway, I don't know. We can move on to something else. But you tell me, like, do you feel like
I do. Drawing back onto the very beginning of this conversation, we were going to talk about tzimtzum.
Yeah.
Right. Tzimtzum.
We can go back there. Yeah.
Means the removal, so to speak, of God's infinite power and presence in order to make space for us. So we know that there is a debate between great Kabbalistic masters. Was that literal? Did God really remove himself, or was it just metaphorical? And I think the argument that you're presenting over here is really to show how it's very much metaphorical. In other words, God, we're really in God. God, we're not something new. God did not remove himself. We're just a continuation of God. The perception that we have that we are things separate of him was what was created. And the other side would argue that creation is something new, which was not in God before, which means God, so to speak, removed himself from the space, so to speak, of which where will exist these separate beings, thus making them actual separate beings.
So is that a question or a statement? What is that?
I think I'm just summarizing,
Right.
bringing it back
So
to that conversation.
we can go back to Tzimtzum, but the characterization of Tzimtzum, of the debate of Tzimtzum, I think is a mischaracterization. Meaning, like, what are the origins of this? You know, what academics refer to as Lurianic mysticism, Lurianic Kabbalah, which is the Kabbalah of the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria of Tzfas, or eventually Tzfas, right? So he had introduced certain new layers in understand. Now, this is based on everything we discussed. This should be clear. In other words, he may not have phrased it this way, but and also, and I believe you had other episodes in your podcast, that which have actually discussed like the history of Lurianic mysticism in contrast to his teachers and his predecessors, and also a very important part of like how this was transcribed, that he had disciples, he had students, especially Rabbi Chaim Vital, which became like the standard credible version of his teachings. So this is discussed and transcribed in his teachings, Eitz Chaim, Bav Yesharim, where what he did essentially was Kabbalah before him had basically resigned at some point and said, look, we can try to build back our connection, our relationship with the Creator, but at some point, like, we'll never really have a relationship with the essence of the Creator, the most infinite aspects of the Creator, because that gap is just too great. That gap between creation and Creator is unbridgeable. What the Arizal was attempting to do, I think successfully did, is he introduced a notion of, no, you can trace creation back to Creator without either compromising on the integrity of Creator or compromising on the existence of creation. Because prior to the Arizal, the only way to bridge the gap between the infinite and the finite, the Creator and the creation, was either to say, obviously this is an oversimplification, but it was either to say that the creation is not really finite or doesn't really exist. And therefore, the gap is not that broad because creation doesn't really exist. Or by saying the Creator is not really infinite. It's like, it's not an absolute infinity. It's like a relative infinity or of some sort. But to have them both maintain their existence and still see how there can be a genuine, authentic relationship, which is where we started, that's what Tzimtzum allows for. That's where the Arizal innovates. Now, here's my point. regarding the way you characterized it, my criticism of that, is that I refuse to, and I think that the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who discusses this, I refuse to concede, or to cede, I should say, to cede that, we are interpreting the Arizal in a metaphorical, non-literal way, while the other side of the debate is interpreting Tzimtzum in the literal way. Because that puts one side of the debate in an immediate and automatic disadvantage. Do you follow?
Mm-hmm.
Because what right do you have to take the Arizal's writings and to just interpret it arbitrarily in a way that suits you? That's basically cheating. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's uncharacteristic of those great sages that took the position of this debate, of this Kabbalistic debate, and said, no, the Arizal's idea of Tzimtzum was, I'm going to use your words, even though I don't agree with it, you'll see, right, was metaphorical. It's uncharacteristic of them, knowing their teachings and knowing them, obviously not personally, but knowing them and knowing their students and knowing their entire approach, to say, here they just they had to make things fit their narrative, so they just defined it differently. But it's such a cheap way of seeing it, and to me that's like it's a gross misrepresentation, even corruption of what the Hebrew term Tzimtzum. Okay, so that's my point. Of what even the term Tzimtzum Shalei Kipshutai means.
Right.
But what I say is that there's different, in Hebrew, in original, biblical Hebrew, especially Kabbalistic Hebrew, especially Hebrew of Chassidus, because Chassidus, basically, this kind of goes to the heart of our conversation. The heart of our conversation is, in some ways, we started off how would I present certain ideas to students or to people that I interact with, that either don't have less of less exposure to Chassidus, more exposure to Chassidus, and a lot of it has to do with deconstruction.
Right.
A lot of it has to do with whatever notions you have. Let's Socratically go back and deconstruct it, where we can think about things differently. And thinking about things differently means that we need to let go of some of our axioms. We need to let go of certain ways that we're used to thinking about things. Don't make any assumptions. Be curious, and let's approach it that way, right? Chassidus discusses things that are abstract, metaphysical, spiritual, and as we said earlier, they're non-temporal, non-spatial, etc. So when you are attempting to define things in that manner, you sometimes need to create language that doesn't exist. Because when we use language, even in Hebrew, in English I would say this is a chair, that's quite obvious. In Hebrew the term is a kisei, everyone knows what you're referencing.
Right.
There are words to describe this,
right.
and we know what you're referencing. But when you're talking about something that cannot be imagined, remember that? Right. It can only be defined and understood. So instead of words, sometimes we have to create longer words out of phrases. And a phrase becomes a word. And a phrase is a description that tells you what, that kind of describes what this is. So one way of reading it in Hebrew would be, and now try to visualize, okay? We're going to give you permission to imagine for a moment. Try to visualize in Hebrew. If you're familiar with Hebrew, we'll try to give an English analogy as well. Is try to visualize Tzimtzum, comma, Shaloi Kipshutai. Or Tzimtzum, comma, Kipshutai. Right? That's the debate. The Hebrew words for the debate.
Right.
Now visualize, not Tzimtzum, comma, I will in a moment, yes. Not Tzimtzum, comma, Shaloi Kipshutai. Rather, Tzimtzum, hyphen, Shaloi Kipshutai. What's a hyphen?
Connect.
Yes. So in other words, you're not reading it Tzimtzum. What? You're not reading the Tzimtzum. Okay, now comes the translation. Tzimtzum, we're not going to translate because we already dealt with that. Rather, the Tzimtzum, Shaloi Kipshutai is non-literal. Shaloi Kipshutai, no. It's not that the tzimtzum is non-literal. Rather, there are different kinds of tzimtzum. There's type A tzimtzum, there's type B tzimtzum, there's a shalei kapshuta kind of tzimtzum. It's a kind of tzimtzum. It's not a non-literal tzimtzum, it's a type of tzimtzum. What type of tzimtzum is it? The type of tzimtzum that it is the one where it's not a trick or a fake or a metaphor of like, you think this is this, but really you don't know. No, it's rather that that even as far as the creator is concerned, the creator acknowledges that there's a part of him that doesn't feel like him.
Yeah.
So use that as like, you ever fall asleep on your arm or on your foot and like it's part of you, but it doesn't feel like it's part of you.
Right.
But there's no question that it's part of you. So that's why I wouldn't characterize it as I wouldn't characterize the debate as one opinion says it's literal tzimtzum, the other one opinion says it's metaphorical tzimtzum. No, one opinion says it's contraction, the other one opinion says it's concealment.
Very good, yeah.
It's literal concealment,
right?
And the other one says it's literal contraction.
Yeah.
They're both opinions are defining it literally.
Right.
They're just arguing about the definition.
Right. I mean, which obviously must happen when anybody opens any Kabbalistic or even philosophical book where it says, the infinite light of God goes all the way up high to no end, all the way down to no finish. What do you mean up and down? We're speaking about infinite light over here. So there obviously needs to be conceptual. You have to have some sort of conceptual understanding. And then just look at the diagrams with circles and everything. There's obviously no circles in there, right?
Yeah. So each one of those have definitions, but here we have like a word that translates both of them. How do you say tzimtzum shalei kipshuta in English? How do you say it? Concealment.
Shalei kipshuta, concealment, right.
How do you say tzimtzum kipshuta in English?
Contraction. Or removal, actually. Removal.
They're kind of synonymous in this context. Contraction means that you're removing from a certain spot. So fine, granted. But concealment, you see, like, let's move away. Let's move away from being stuck in this paradigm of defining it characterizing it as a literal tzimtzum versus a non-literal tzimtzum. No, that's garbage. You hear where I'm coming from? And this really goes to the heart of everything we spoke about. So now, if we want to like restring the sentence again, the restring of the sentence again is that it's all about a relationship between creator and creation. It's all about bridging a gap between the creator and creation. It's all about creation having the ability to have a relationship with the creator. The only way that the creation can actually have a relationship with the creator on its terms is if the creator conceals himself to some degree to make space for the creation to approach him, for the creation to allow him to enter. That's tzimtzum.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Please share this video with someone who you think might be interested. It really helps out with the algorithm. Or you can buy me a coffee by using the link in the description with buymeacoffee.com, where you can also become a monthly member. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and hope to see you again next time.